Our next speaker is Randy Clark. I can tell you that I am a Connecticut collector, and I actually joined this club in order to pursue knowledge and information about Connecticut's. And the first convention I went to was in Boston, and I went up to a table, and there was a person, and it was Randy, I learned later, who was doing lot viewing, and I asked to look at a particular coin, and he handed it to me, and then he wanted to see it, and I showed it to him, and he said, "Oh, well, that's a 33 whatever." And I thought, he is a magician. And I thought to myself, one day I want to be like that guy. And so
I don't think so.
Let me tell you, Randy has written a wonderful book for us, and it will be the definitive word in Connecticut coppers for the rest of our lives, that's for sure, and probably ever. And it is a wonderful book. And he is here today to share with us some of his knowledge. And the topic that he's going to be speaking on is recent literature for attributing Connecticut's from 1785 to 1788 Connecticut coppers. With that, Randy, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for all staying long enough to enjoy this discussion about Connecticut coppers. And I hope those of you who collect the series find it interesting, and those of you who don't yet collect the series will appreciate how literature in a book evolves like this. And I just want to say, I wish Jack had given that presentation that he gave years ago. It would have made everything so much easier. I had to, relearn all that same information, and I had fun doing it, but it was kind of stressful, as you can imagine. So I'm not going to talk so much today about the mechanics of collecting Connecticut coppers. I'm going to talk about more of the literature and then the content of the book itself. And for putting the book together, I can share many of the same comments that Jack had shared in terms of the logistics, et cetera. The decisions for a Connecticut coppers book that needed a century's worth of updating kind of forced me to go a different direction in terms of size, in terms of image content, et cetera. And so admittedly, this book's a little on the large side, and frankly, it could have been twice as big if we just didn't start limiting the information that was going in it. But let me first kind of just go through the history of the Connecticut coppers briefly, and then we'll talk about how this effort evolved. So we'll go a one-pager into the Connecticut coppers background, just a one-pager. That could be a talk in and of itself. And Chris wrote a book on it, and it could certainly be embellished a lot more. Talk a little bit about the founding publications, the usual characters, the Dickinson, Crosby, Hall, Miller. Go through legacy sources for attributing Connecticut coppers. There are a lot of Connecticut coppers, as you know. So understanding the details between them is important. The ongoing need for a focused update on Connecticut coppers that led to this new book. And then in 2021, the publication of the identification and classification of Connecticut coppers. And I'll go over what the objectives of the publication were and an overview of the contents. I'm not going to read this whole slide. I'm sorry, I'm a techie. I tried to pull out the critical bullets. For Connecticut coppers in general, they were allowed by the Articles of Confederation because the Articles of Confederation said while Congress is granted the rights to regulate the alloy and value of coins by their own authority, they left open the work or the occurrence where the states themselves could coin money. Now, the states were making paper money for quite a while, as everybody knows. But in terms of striking coins, the Articles of Confederation did not disallow that. And by 1785, the U.S. Congress started to work on their weights and measures for a number of different systems. They started to only make progress in 86 and later in 87, where they actually defined the decimal system and started the Fugio contract. So in 1785, there wasn't much progress going on, and I don't think the states had that much confidence that the Fed was actually going to, be doing a federal money system anytime soon. So in October of 1785, it must have been about 6 months after Vermont did that, the state of Connecticut authorized the state coinage. The Connecticut terminated the rights in May 1789. Obviously, coins weren't made over that long a period in state, but the rights were still there. It was based on Connecticut's pounds, shillings, pence system. One Spanish dollar was worth 6 Connecticut shillings in 1785. And so that was about 108 coppers per dollar. And the in-state valuation, while it wasn't in the authorizing legislation, the in-state valuation was 18 coppers per shilling, at least until the coppers panic started to hit. While it was authorized at 6 pennyweight, which is about 144 grains, all the accounting we find, whether it's in the Treasury Board or in the Mint account books or wherever, all the accounting was done at 145.8 grains because that was a nice even number at 48 coppers per pound. So the minting authorization limited the size of the contract to 10,000 pounds, and that would have been about 3.6 million coppers. And in essence, that many coppers plus were made. So I guess was successful in that regard. Unfortunately, because of the coppers panic, you're all aware, the valuation dropped. Records are all over the map, 24 per shilling, 27 per shilling, 48 per shilling, depending on who, what, when, and where. But certainly the valuation plummeted. And the mint itself, the New Haven efforts closed around the end of 1788, based on the account books that we found. And then we know, of course, that coining went on in other locations like Machen's, probably for no more than another year would be my guess. And then we found the records of the state treasury divesting of their last casks of coppers, kind of like the Bank of New York coppers, or at least these were Connecticut's. They divested in July 1791 at 52 per shilling, which is severely devalued. We figured that about 4 million coppers were coined in the New Haven Mint. There's not a clear number because the original sources don't all agree as for what was done. Whether it's the mint records or the inspection records or the state treasury records, they all have a slightly different number, but it's about that big. And we estimate, around 500,000 coins struck at unauthorized out-of-state mints, and there's no records in terms of what, Machen's and other mints did. We're still trying to decide how many other mints there were. And so these things circulated, all up and down the East Coast. Connecticut did a lot of trading with New York and Massachusetts because they were the deep water ports. I don't seem to sense that Boston had a huge Connecticut coppers presence, but New York certainly did, as well as the New Jersey coppers and the Machen's coppers. And then obviously the Fed started working, 1792, 1793 on their federal coinages. They couldn't get a lot of volume going very quickly. And they tried to demonetize all copper coins, whether they were foreign or domestic, that weren't made by the Fed themselves. They tried to demonetize them in 1804. We generally believe the Connecticut coppers, as well as the New Jerseys and everything else, circulated in a declining capacity until the small cents came out. And then around that time, the Fed was trying to collect all the large cents and replace them with small cents. But by that point, in the mid 1800s, numismatics had begun. We're starting to see auction catalogs. We're starting to see collections being formed and research happening. And so by the time that the state coppers were officially being taken out of circulation, I think they were being snapped up by the collectors. That's all on that. So now let's just take a look at the literature. John Warner Barber published a lot of early histories on New England, and he published the first illustration in 1841 that I can find. He didn't talk about Connecticut coppers. He just published an illustration. So, okay. Thank you, John Barber, for raising the topic. John Hickox is the first one that investigated the early mint history. He seems to have went to the Connecticut State Archives and started data mining there. And there's a bunch of guys, Hickox, Dickinson, all about the same time that started publishing that early mint history information. So I'm not sure who was first and who was derivative, but it's about that time. Montraville Dickinson is the first guy that attempted classification, and he did a fantastic job of trying. What he came up were varieties based on obverses only, which, you know, you can't do that. And he hypothesized a lot of obverse types. I don't think he had found examples of each one, but he was bold enough to say on the far right of this table how many varieties he thinks were associated with each obverse. So he must have been looking at the reverses. He just didn't classify them. And so this was kind of a no-go. You can't do this by obverse only and make a sustainable attempt at classification. So later in 1875, Crosby is the first one that roughs out a classification system for both obverses and reverses. And that worked out fantastic. He basically put together buckets of similar legends. He did not address subvarieties, which are different dyes that have the same buckets, but are slightly different. So he didn't hit the subvarieties. He considered it beyond the scope of his work. And in terms of illustrations, he only illustrated 25 wholly or partially. And so at this point, you know, there's a lot of information coming together on categorization, but there's no illustrations. So everything's textual descriptions. Dr. Thomas Hall, this guy was fantastic. He's my hero. He's the guy who decided to do the subvariety designation. So he expanded on Crosby, defined all the subvarieties, and described them in his personal manuscript. You see 3 pages there I lifted from his personal manuscript in the Connecticut State Library. He's kind of the author of the main attribution system. He was friends with William Wallace Hayes, and he allowed William Wallace Hayes to make a laborious copy of his handwritten work. And that copy, the Hayes copy of this, was sold in the Ford Library, but it was purchased by Hillier Ryder back in the when the Hayes collection went up for sale. So Hillier Ryder owned the copy of Hall's early work, and they took different paths. Whereas Hall continued to maintain his work, the Hayes copy was not maintained. And we'll talk about that on the next page of why that's important. One thing Hall did do was he officially published the 1787 date only in about 1892. We're not sure how many copies of this were made, but it's believed it's around 20 copies, you know, possibly 30. And it was basically submitted for peer review. And there's a fantastic copy of that. I believe Dan Hamelberg owns Hall's personal copy of that 1892 published work. It's fantastic. You see him continuing to edit and refine the 1787s. But in his personal handwritten manuscript, he continued to evolve the 85s, 86s, and 88s. But the problem here is there's no illustrations whatsoever in any of this work. So this is strictly textual. And the peer collectors at the time in the form of Hayes, Canfield, Ryder, they all had to go by those descriptions. The fascinating part about this is you're starting to see people ink their coins. They're like, okay, I'm going to read these text descriptions. I'm going to try to find out what this is. I'm going to ink the coin so I don't forget and I don't have to do it again. And so the pictures below are generally from Bobby Martin's collection, Neil, the photographer, Hall inked his own coins on the edge of the coin, which is, and they're highly coveted by those of us who collect the Connecticut coppers for ink on edge. And then Canfield and Hayes inked their coins on the obverse. And we tell the difference between a Canfield ink and a Hayes ink by whether there's a line separating the two. But Hall's work was so good that his peer collectors started to ink their coins with his attribution system. The problem ultimately with Hall's work is he didn't publish it in a significant way. He didn't publish all the years, and that's where Henry Miller really stepped up. In 1920, he published the entire series, mostly textual descriptions. He leveraged Hall's work, frankly cannibalized it, but he made improvements and modifications to it and made it somewhat of his own. He worked with Hillier Ryder to prepare it. Ryder owned that Hayes copy of Hall's manuscript. And so we can tell that some of the things that Hall continued to modify never made it into Miller's book because Miller didn't have the original Hall manuscript. He had Hayes's copy. And one thing Miller did is he revised some of Hall's obverse 33s, which were already difficult to attribute. And Miller scrambled the order of the 33s and 37s. And so, that kind of threw the collectors for a loop for a short while where they tried to figure out how they're going to redesignate the varieties. What you see below are some Canfield inks where he's got the Hall designation in the left obverse field, and then he had to go back and put the Miller designation in the right obverse field. So these are fascinating coins. Some people get tripped up by the Hall designations. They say it's improperly attributed, and it's actually not the case. It was attributed using Hall's original designations and then later had to be revised. Miller had come up with 312 varieties, and that's what was in the main American Journal of Numismatics publication. And then Miller passed away before the book was actually published. So Hillier Ryder and Frederick Canfield almost immediately published additions and corrections to Miller's work. They upped the number of varieties to 319. They pruned some out and they added some more. So 319 is where things sat in 1920, and that's under the basis of the Connecticut Copper series. And while there's been a lot of great work in the Colonial newsletter, in the C4 newsletter, private work done, everybody's basically leveraging off of this 1920 Miller's work. So briefly, it's just tabular. Dickinson only defined obverse types. He didn't define any other reverse types, etc. He had a count of 290 total varieties if you add it up. Crosby redefined the obverse and reverse types, but he didn't look at subtypes. We don't know how many varieties Crosby thought there were. Miller, 312 in his initial publication, 319 after the additions and corrections. That's the baseline. So now if you look at what's happened since then, right? I don't know how to get a pointer. Let me see if I can get a pointer. Tate, maybe I don't dare do that in the middle of the presentation. Oh, okay, here. So here's the Miller 312 and the E and C. And so we've had this trajectory of new discoveries, pruning in some cases, additions mostly. And the variety count, as where it stands now, was 354 when this work was published in June, 355 now, and possibly 356, depending on what you guys conclude on a specimen that's floating around for peer review at Baltimore. So my book's already obsolete, which is hilarious, right? So the major revisions happened by Barnsley in 1964 and 1962. This guy's a rock star in terms of working on the Connecticut Copper series. And Jeff Rock got in there in 1991. He did some pruning and some additions. And so when you see the variety count goes down, it's because some things that were thought to exist turned out to actually be existing varieties, and the series needed some pruning. Okay. So, what I've been trying to do in this book is to try to retrace this history. There's actually tables in the book where I go by variety and I show when it was discovered and in some cases when it was eliminated. If you ever can't sleep at night, those are great tables to review. Here for So after the founding publications, what happened? So Miller and Hall were all textual descriptions, drove everybody nuts. Fortunately, the auction sales started to happen and people could start looking at what was coming up in auction. Mostly what was coming up in auction were the kind of less rare varieties, and you could start seeing enough images so that you're pretty certain of your attributions. The first auction plates I found were in 1877. There's only a couple. You don't see a tremendous amount of plating going on until the 1970s with the EAC 75. And that was key. The images always tended to be coin size, about an inch, right? So even with the glass, it's hard to see, particularly with the dot matrix of the printing that was going on at the time. So you could cultivate these auction plates, but it wasn't making your life easy. More recently, we've got the large multi-series encyclopedias like the Bowers Encyclopedia. And I'll say Bowers Encyclopedia is the first publication to illustrate all the Connecticut copper obverses and reverses. That was really quite a milestone. I was hoping to beat him in that, but I didn't. So kudos to the Whitman effort. I was able to contribute to it. And then the price guides, like the Red Book and Waite Raymond's guides, had a lot more images. So more images were coming out. The good thing about the encyclopedias is they tended to have some of the more rare stuff because that was most interesting to those encyclopedia authors. But the images continued to be about an inch big. So, one of the ones that we all like to go back to is the Miller sale. Miller, after Miller's death, before publication of his work, Miller had a sale in 1920, 382 Connecticut lots, 50 wholly or partially illustrated. And these are quality pictures. I've seen Jack work on these plates where he scanned them and cleaned them up, and they're just fantastic. Yeah, but he's got duplicates of some varieties, and a lot of varieties were plated. So while he had 244 total different varieties in there, he only had 50 plated. Okay, so that was a start. EAC 75 is really when it all happened. I think everybody's got multiple copies of EAC 75, and they're all worn out. A lot of them have Breen's pink marker annotations on them. I think Bobby Martin used to just bring his EAC 75 catalogs to the conventions just to have Breen write something interesting on them. And someday we hope to find out where those are, right? But Taylor is another one. Fantastic images in Taylor. Same thing, you look at this Taylor copy, it's all worn out. So the EAC 75 and Taylor, and then Perkins. These were three fantastic sales where people were now getting 1-inch sized images of the easy and difficult varieties to supplement Miller's textual notes. Where I came in, right, was about the era of the online sales. So not only do you get a catalog, but if you had the time and the desire, you could log onto the websites and you could pull down image after image of the obverses and reverses in whatever quality that the auction house took. The Ford images are fantastic. They're not color correct, but they were really good. And so around 2005, 2006, I started to throw together what I called the illustrated Miller, just so I had Miller's text descriptions and Ford or EAC 75 images all in one spot. And, and that's kind of how this Connecticut Coppers book was born. I went to the 2006 Boston convention and I showed it to Bobby Martin. I met Bobby Martin and Neil Rothschild and Sid and Roger Saboni and Ray Williams and everybody at that 2006 convention. I said, what do you think about this spiral bound work? And it got a lot of support, and that evolved into what this Connecticut Coppers book eventually became. The SLT images, fantastic. Bobby Martin's images, Neil's images, but the one that really gave this book the kick in the pants that it needed to get it done was Partrick's images. Partrick had like every box plate coin known to man. So every coin was stellar. And the photo quality that Heritage used was fantastic. Now, Bobby Martin and I were able to get access to those images back in 2015, back when the Partrick sale was expected to go off. And the sales got delayed, I understand, for a number of family reasons, right? But we were working with those images for 3 to 5 years. And so I was able to move this work forward in a substantial way because the image qualities were so good and the specimens were so good. We already spoke briefly about the Whitman Encyclopedia. It's fantastic because of its completeness. The only drawback is the size is 1 inch. And the other thing I'll note is it's not always one photo is enough. Sometimes the Connecticut's can have weak spots on one side or the other. Sometimes the best coin doesn't have all the detail. It doesn't have the die states. And so, started to look at, is one image, even if it's bigger, is one image sufficient? And clearly, if you've seen the book, I've concluded, no, it wasn't. And then obviously Breen's work, and then Phil Mossman's work. And a shout out to Phil Mossman. Phil was a major editor of this Connecticut Coppers work, and he's seen every version of it dating all the way back to 2006, and made sure all my punctuation and logic was correct. Okay. So summary, just going through the history, the founding publications were predominantly textual. Plated catalogs filled the gap. This is the workhorse until the online sales. The encyclopedias, great supplemental information because they had a lot of the odd and rare ones, but again, small images. Online sales, I have the temperament to be able to harvest those by downloading them, cataloging them. A lot of people don't. So back in to 2020, it was a go for get this dedicated work on Connecticut Coppers done and improve the image quality and the descriptive text. Now, I'll put a caveat in here. Bobby Martin had always told me just focus on the attribution portion of this book, the photos, the updated text, the die states. And I just never felt that the book would be complete without a front end that went through the history and more detail. And Bobby used to just say, forget about that. Nobody's going to read it. So most of the work on this book had focused just strictly on the photographic portion. But I'm going to talk, I did take the time to bolt on the front end of this book. And unfortunately, while I was bolting on the front end to this book, I lost some of the major players that were, sponsors of the work, if you will, in the form of Bobby Martin, Neil, and Sid. So, I still think that was the right trade-off to add the introductory material, though, I just feel terrible that, I couldn't get that done early enough that everybody could enjoy it, right? So in July of 2021, we published the book, right? Now this is talking to Jack. It's like, Jack, what do I do for a cover? And we talked about the logistics of a cover, and I found an old map of Connecticut. I had some stellar images from Partrick, and I don't know if Jim Rosen grabbed this this letter from the Connecticut Historical Society, but I kind of threw this together, picked the blue color because that's a Connecticut color, and it seemed to work. I think the tan and blue just works. So okay, they got that done. And then, but I wanted the boards embossed underneath. So we did the board embossing. This is a it's not a ray trace, but it's a trace I did with a pen tablet of a Connecticut copper. I did it by hand. And so that's what's underneath the dust jacket if you ever take a look under the cover. And then the title page, I always use this coin by Bobby Martin. I think it's a 3339 S2. And I went out of my way to make sure I eventually owned that coin just because it's a tie back to Bobby Martin and Neil and in this book, right? But we kind of put this together. This is the pretty outer portion. We'll talk about the content. And so the book objectives, number one was the photographic attribution guide. This is the piece that Bobby Martin and frankly Sid, as well as Neil, told me focus on this. This is the work that everybody's struggling with. We got to break away from the textual descriptions, right? So it's a picture book primarily, 500 pages of large grayscale obverse and reverse images. Now I chose grayscale because I can't get color uniformity. If an image is from Ford, it's reddish. If it's an image is from Neil, it's more yellowish, brownish. If an image is from Heritage, it's one way. And Sid and I used to banter about this, but Sid basically said, if you're just trying to point out detail, use grayscale. The other thing that was said at the time is that the publishing costs of color were supposed to be prohibitive, right? So I was trying to find a way to keep the publishing costs down. So grayscale was used because it shows the detail. Later, when we added the introduction, I talked to the publisher and I said, well, can I do a limited front section in color and keep the bulk of the book in grayscale? And how would that cost out? And actually, that was a good compromise. So while the bulk of this book is 500 pages in grayscale, the rest of it, the introduction, is in color. And I think that it went a long way to keep the cost down, though it was a logistical issue to try to find out how to marry color sections with black and white sections. Okay. And I'll go through some of the things that are in that photographic section. I did do this condensed intro. It reviews multiple topics associated from this with the series. I try not to go in too much depth on any one because there's so much. And I tried to put references. There's a big reference section in the back that says, okay, if you want more information, go there. And I list a good bibliography of other things that you should consider reading if you're going to focus on the series. And I have a big original sources table, which talks about, you know, where are the mint records, the treasury records, the inspection records, the leases associated with the series. And I try to get all that information down. But the thing that I felt most strongly about is Bobby Martin and I had started collecting folders of articles, whether it's a 1-pager or a 5-pager or published in a book. We just were tracking who was writing anything about this series in the 19th and 20th century. And a lot of these people had published interesting things, and then we're going to get lost in the sands of time. So I made sure that I touched on as many people as I could that had something to say about this series. And you may not agree that it was all important, right? So some of it is scathing, right? Some people either wrote a scathing review of Miller's book or wrote a scathing commentary on the series itself. But it's there. I mean, it's referenced. And so I made sure I noted all that. I tended not to spend a lot of time on what was in Pennywise, CNL, and C4 because their authors are already immortalized, if you will, in that forum. And frankly, the amount of publishing that happened in the CNL and C4N, making sure everybody got a shout out, it would have just doubled the size of the book. So I focused on the people that weren't so well published, just to make sure that their contributions were noted. What was not an objective? Yeah, this is an interesting conversation Jeff Rock and I were having about, hey, how come you didn't put this in the book? And I had to think about it. How did it not get in the book? And I tended to stray away from subjective topics. Grading, I'm no good at grading. Bobby Martin was great at grading. I always relied on him to do it. When it comes to me, you know, I look for strike. Bobby Martin looked for color surfaces. Other people look for other aspects of it. And of course, there's always the buyer thinks it's a higher grade, or the lower grade, and the seller thinks it's a higher grade. I just stayed away from grading standards. Ray Williams did a great bolt on to an EAC book to cover a grading guide for colonials, and then PhotoGrade, I guess, did an attempt there. So I think a shout out to these guys for trying, but nobody's ever going to agree on grading standards. And I don't think we agree with what the slab people necessarily are doing either. I've traced coins as they've gone through different sales, and there's grade inflation constantly going on. And I don't know the criteria that they're using while they're doing it. So I stayed away from grading. If you're staying away from grading, then you're staying away from a condition census. And this is a bone of contention. I understand. Connecticut's is a big series. To put together a 5-coin or 10-coin condition census on every variety would have been a time-consuming effort. And Bobby Martin was supposed to do that in his retirement, and just never seemed to got around to doing it. So condition census in and of itself is subjective. You have to have a common view of grading to decide on what your condition census. Now, what Bobby and I always talked about is, well, maybe we put the best 10 together and we don't rank them. And then that was kind of the best that was going to happen. And then when Bobby wasn't able to do that, I just omitted the whole thing from it. If you think about it, if you have a condition census of 10 coins, only 20, very few of the people reading this book are going to have a condition census coin. So, no need to I have fun with these Connecticut's, whether I have a condition census coin or not. So maybe I'm just making excuses. I'm actually starting to work on a condition census now, just based on people's encouragement, but it's slow going. Valuations. There are valuations out there in the Colonial Encyclopedia, the Red Book, and other places. The best places to look for valuations are Datamine, Heritage, and Stacks, and look for what it's sold for. Sometimes you get one or two bidders just that have to have the coin, and it goes much higher than it should be. But these days, Heritage and Stacks are making it very easy to search their archives, and you can see kind of what the coins are doing, and you can figure out which ones had unusual activity and which ones kind of established the value of the coin. So there's a lot of information out there already on that. It didn't need to be in this book. So this is briefly what it looked like. So in 2005, this is what I walked to the 2006 Boston convention with. And people were so fascinated by it that I ended up making 9 or 10 copies and giving them to private people there based on Bobby Martin and Neil's guidance as for who were the movers and shakers in C4. Originally, it was just small images, not much bigger than 1 inch, and a Miller text. I evolved it later to 2.5-inch images, and each page dedicated to a variety, and starting to call out what I was personally fascinated with, which are the nuances of the variety. I did do a test run of this thing on a photo website that does wedding books. You load your JPEGs, and out comes a very expensive, what looks like hardbound book. And that clearly wasn't the way to go. That was $400 a pop for those things. And I put together enough of those to socialize them with the C4 Publications Committee and say, you like where this is going. And Mixbook was the photo web service. And they had a 300-page limit. And I couldn't squeeze it into 300 pages. So I did a 2-volume set, one on obverses, one on reverses, and that's why it was so expensive. And I think I made 10 of those, and that was the end of that. At $400 a pop, I wasn't going to do it anymore. But it allowed me to kind of go out for peer review on the way this was shaping up, and the feedback was uniformly positive, just consolidated to 1 volume. Okay. So in 2021, it was published. So some shout outs. These are very influential people for this work. Bobby Martin, who was the muse, the mentor, and was actually supposed to write content for it. But I guess we all know Bobby really wasn't ever going to do that, right? Neil, whose photography got this thing kickstarted when he was going. Images of his collection, Bobby Martin's collection, Sid's collection, even some Tony stuff was in there. Sid Martin, generous with his images, and his holdings were so extensive that he would have multiple very rare specimens that allowed me to illustrate evolution of dye in ways that if he hadn't shared would have been very difficult. Editors of the book itself are Phil Mossman, Ray Williams, and Jim Rosen. Thank them all for their time and attention. And Phil was reviewing it for more than 10 years. So that's a tremendous amount of time and effort on his part. A print run was 200 copies. I think Jack said his was 200 copies as well. The way the book is laid out, 94 pages up front of the history of Connecticut coppers and the authors and all the kind of incidentals of the series. 54 pages of tables, basically classifying the system, going through its when varieties were discovered, some ways to do collecting, in basically guidance on the nuts and bolts itself, and then 500 pages of photo stuff. Now, I wasn't going to put the bunk towns in here. I'm kind of, was on the fence about containing the bunk towns, and I was more than strongly encouraged to do a bunk town section in there. And I hope I was objective on that because, sometimes I'm not quite sure where the bunk towns came from and what to make of them, but they're highly sought after, very collectible, and they needed to be documented with the series, right? And then appendices, bibliography, image credits, right? So let me run you through it. So the important parts, the images are 2.5 inches big, and there's multiple. It's in order of dye state. I tried to do early, mid, late. If there's not a lot of dye state, then I did the best looking first, right? What I wanted was that top image to be the one that people would go to first, and most of what you needed to see was on it, right? Sometimes that doesn't happen and you need 2 or 3 coins to describe a variety, and that's why it's there. Or in the case of this one, it's breaking, right? So I tried to describe that. Grayscale used for uniformity. And once you have high quality images, now you can start zooming in and you can see really, really cool stuff if you're into it, right? Double punched sync foils, as you've seen here. A crack coming down through the eye, crack out the back. Whatever interested me and I thought would interested others, I tried to call out. Updated textual descriptions. I did not reuse Miller's descriptions. You could, but now that you have images, you don't have to spend your words quite the same way that Miller and Hall did, right? So it's updated. And more information on dye states and how it's evolving, and less information on just how to identify it, because I'm thinking most people are going to use the images for identification and use the text just as verification. Obverse and reverse pairings are called out. And in the case of this one, Miller's 3333 obverse was Hall's 3330 obverse. So if you see some ink that says 3330, then it was probably inked before the Miller book came out. So this is important for those of you that kind of are looking at inks, or maybe an old envelope that came with the coin. If it has a different designation, check to see if it's the old Hall designation. Brief descriptions of die strike, characteristics, die state, anything interesting that I thought I wanted to call out. Most cases, I make an attempt at striking order. But in a lot of cases, it's not clear. And in some cases, there's what I call out of sequence striking order, where it looks like it started with one obverse or reverse, went to the next, and then went back to the first one based on the die state. So there's some real crazy things that happened. Must be when these coins are in high volume production. General comments about weights, and then the breakouts of interesting details. I add a lot of photo plates in here. Now, these are things that I was using for myself. So in many cases, the information was available, needed to be cleaned up. So I've got obverse and reverse plates. It's a smaller picture, but if you want to scan quickly, that's the way to go. Reverse branches. Sometimes you can find out what it is a whole lot faster, particularly the Z's for 1787. You just look at this branch thing, you can nail it really quick. And these are full-size pages in there. With the breastplate with the 1786s, the sync foil positions with the 1787s. These are cheat sheets I was using. I'm hoping everybody's going to find them to be very useful for a quick identification. I also look at varieties where interesting things are going on. Either it's 2 very similar varieties like this A1, A4. They might have been derivative dyes, but I do a side-by-side compare. G1, G2 in the 1785s. The difficulty of determining whether you've got the 514 versus the 515. Again, if you're not a Connecticut collector, all this probably seems like minutia and nuance. But if you're going to collect the series, sometimes it's hard to decide between 2 varieties, and you need some help. Some of the other things that I found, which I thought, again, fascinating from where I sit, is if you look at the orientation of some of these ornaments for dye that are very similar, the rotation of that ornament is really important. And you can say, well, wait, it looks really good, but the ornaments aren't pointing in the right direction, and it's not the right dye. And so I called that, what's the point? So there's the different E punches that were used, whether it was what I call a Gothic E or a E cut from an F. So I call that coining with E's. Yeah, sorry for the corny things, but I was having fun at the time. There's different O punches and different C's. So I kind of make people aware that, if all is lost and there's not much detail in your coin, start looking at some of this stuff and maybe you can tell. In the front material, briefly covers wide topics of interest and references on where to find more information. In some cases, Chris's book will go into a lot more detail on what's going on, but I touched on it and tried to reference his book. There's other books out there that cover interesting detail. There's the C&Ls and C4s. So I didn't try to just replicate pre-existing material. If I went into detail, it's because I thought I was putting information in that wasn't yet out there. Okay. It goes through the history of Connecticut coppers, from mint authorization to closing it up. Biographies, touching on biographies. Again, Chris does much more in depth. The history of research and collecting of Connecticut coppers, which basically goes through the early authors researching a series and writing about it, and then the early people collecting it. And then the classification system in terms of how it evolved and where it stands. I go a little bit into metrology in terms of looking at weight statistics, et cetera. You saw this plot already, which shows the evolution of the number of varieties, and this number keeps changing. So back in March it was 254. I think last month it was. I'm sorry, 354. Last month it was 355, and we'll see what happens this weekend, whether it's bumped up one more. I look at all my rarities. I'm a traditionalist. I use the old kind of EAC 75 rarity rating system. I'm not critical of the Whitman URS scale. It's just my comfort zone was in these older rarities. And I put the URS scale adjacent so that, if you want to translate between them, you can. And then I look at how many rarity 1s are there, how many rarity 6s, how many rarity 9s. If you look at what's going on, there are 128 rarity 5s in this Connecticut series. So most by far are rarity 5. And if you plot that out, it kind of looks like this. They're different years. I think this is 85, 86, 88, 87, and the total. And so, when you're collecting Connecticut coppers that there aren't a lot of R1s through R4s out there, right? So you're in for an interesting time to collect. I spent some time looking at production anomalies, overstrikes, undertypes, because that's an important part of the Connecticut series. The New Jersey 56Ns and many other New Jerseys are struck over Connecticut copper. So I tried to do a shout out to the New Jersey guys. A lot of the 1788 Connecticut's are struck over Nova Constellatios, or in one case, mass copper. So I try to do undertypes and overtypes. And I look at production errors, whether it's clipped planchets or rotational misalignments or offsets, just to kind of get the topics out there, right? I don't go into gory detail about the production nuances of that. Maybe Jim Rosen will, and his co-authors will do that sometime. I look at some of the fakes. I tried to keep it obvious fakes. This wasn't meant to be breaking new ground and calling something out. But there are obvious fakes. There's cast coppers out there. And then there's, coppers that were meant to be copies and are annotated as copies, and others that are not annotated as copies. Then there's fantasy pieces. I just try to show some examples so you know what's out there. I go into varieties of interest or note, and I'm not going to spend time here because this would be a whole nother discussion about collecting approaches. I think Ray Williams was encouraging me to spend some time and throw out some ideas on collecting approaches, whether it's a date set or a nickname type set or 100, 200, or 300 varieties. And I try to call out some varieties of interest or note. Either it's a unique head that has a name or it's a legend misspelling or something. And so that, and I illustrate some of them out there. So prospective collectors that are new to the series can take a look at this and come up with some ideas. This is an example of some of the people that I do a shout out for on their publications. And I touch on more in the book than I have listed here. I was mapping this out because you can see the generations. There's clearly a generation here going from Hickox through Hayes, Hall, Betts, up to Richardson, where they were all kind of born in the mid 1800s. And then there's a gap of almost 50 years before the next set comes along. And then some of the lesser known people like Howard Kurth and Cyril Hawley, certainly Newman and Picker and Craigie and these guys come up. And it's interesting because it shows that I think there's cycles that the collecting goes in. And this is probably true for all the series, right? And then obviously shout out to the three last guys here who were major contributors to pulling this book together. So we can do a time check here. I can talk for more. I think I've got my 45 minutes up. I can just flash these really quick. If you've ever wanted to see what a picture from one of the account books from the Connecticut Mint looks like. This is what the Leavenworth Daybook looks like. Daily transactions, whether he's buying butter or getting coppers from the manufacturing site. So this one's received from the copper works 67 pounds of coppers and what it's worth, right? Paid coppers to Mr. Warner for work at the copper works, exchanged coppers for silver. Chris did a great article on the exchanging of coppers for harder currencies. And then, in this case, he's buying fowls, which is basically his chickens, right? So the Daybook is fascinating because you look at the day-to-day transactions. The more kind of structured one is the one from the Jarvis Platt running of the Mint, where they go through specific transactions in here, whether it's inspections. There's clear evidence in here where the Jarvis contingent is in their account book saying we took 24,000 pounds of copper taken from the federal mint for account of the Connecticut Mint. They weren't hiding this. It was documented in their books. And this is a whole nother discussion that the Fujio guys always want to get into. But my point is that they weren't hiding what they were doing when they were using the federal copper for the Connecticut Mint. Their strategy didn't work out. And in the end, they didn't do what was right to make things right with the federal government. But they weren't hiding it. It wasn't like some clandestine activity. And in the Jarvis Platt book, in their reconciliation in September 1788, they're talking about the wastage. They made 63,000 pounds of copper and had 4,600 pounds of wastage, which is interesting. And then on the federal side, what their total striking was and what their wastage was. So there's a lot of great original source material out there. On the Connecticut Treasury records, these are contained in the Connecticut State Library. 1786, they're showing 112 pounds of copper received, which is their 5%. 1787, again, copper received from Jarvis via Jeremiah Platt, James Hillhouse, et cetera. So they're showing the copper coming into the Treasury. In November of 1787, a lot of people don't think New Haven was minting past mid-1787, but they were. November 1787, 3 kegs received from Jeremiah Platt. May 1788, 1 keg of coin coppers received from Jeremiah Platt. So, the Jarvis organization was authorized to make Connecticut coppers and was submitting what they needed to the state. Now, whether everything was, above board or not is probably, another topic. One area I'll give a shout out to Jim Rosen and the gentleman, Jay Knight, getting these letters out of the Connecticut Historical Society talking about mint inspections, communications back and forth between the mint and the Treasury Board. It's fascinating stuff. So there's a huge amount of original source material. What was interesting is some of this stuff, Eric Newman knew about it back in the 50s and didn't do anything with it. And only since the Newman numismatic portal came up can we see that Newman knew about a lot of this stuff. So a lot of this introductory material could have come out even earlier. And I'd like to finish probably with this. In the Connecticut Current of March of 1787, there was a political cartoon talking about the quagmire between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists on whether to accept the new federal constitution. And this cartoon, which appeared, was written from the side of the Federalists. So it's not very kind to the Anti-Federalists. Joseph Hopkins, who was one of the Mint principals, was an Anti-Federalist. They skewered him in editorials in the paper, called him Joe Copper. And in this case, the Federalist is using the pseudonym Cato, and he says, "I despise your coppers." And Joseph Hopkins is saying, "Curse commutation," which was an issue that those of you enjoy the history of the period are familiar with. So here's an example where they're calling him Joe Copper, and there's the first real kind of picture I can find of something that's meant to be a Connecticut copper, and then that's in 1787. So that was fascinating to see this political cartoon. And I'll just leave it at that. I've got a lot of material. Obviously, I could talk for hours and days. I would welcoming feedback on the book. Those of you that have had an opportunity to look at it, I created a Gmail account just to receive feedback on that book. So if you're so kind as to give me feedback, both positive and negative, I think I can handle it either way. I'm looking for feedback because there's just so much information in that book. I don't know whether we got it right and where people would like to see more and where people might want to see less. So thank you all for your time. I hope that you found this talk interesting. Certainly I do. Okay.
Thank you, Randy. Randy, do you have a moment to take some questions?
Of course.
Because I've been thinking of some really hard questions. No. Jeff Rock has a question for you, Randy.
Oh, no.
356 officially.
He says 356 officially. It's more of a comment.
Well, we kind of knew that was a suspicion, but hopefully you got a better image for me. So, okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Any more questions? Randy, we want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your great book. I want to tell everybody that I believe we are living in the golden age of colonial numismatics. The books and the people that we have had here speaking today, the things that we're working on, this is a time that is like no other, and Randy is part of that. So thank you very much, Randy. Randy, we would like to present you with this plaque, which I will mail to you.
Okay, well, let me reach over.
It is to Randy Clark for his presentation entitled Recent Literature for Attributing Connecticut Coppers, 1785 to 1788. This is part of the Eric P. Newman Memorial Lectureship Series. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.